Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about a book, an audiobook I just finished listening to called The Warden by Anthony Trollope. So this is a book that came out in 1855. It was not the first novel that Trollope wrote, but it is the first one that really became successful and kind of launched his reputation and his career. So Anthony Trollope was a very prolific Victorian novelist, kind of a contemporary with folks like Charles Dickens, coming a little later than Jane Austen, but in that kind of realm of 19th century British literature. So if you love the works of Austen and Dickens and others like that, you will really enjoy Trollope, and you would enjoy this book, The Warden. So let me tell you a little bit about why I picked this book up, and a little bit about the plot of the book. I won't give the whole plot and how it resolves, but I'll kind of tell you enough to just sort of set up the story. So if you want no spoilers, you can skip that. But if you don't mind a few, I'll just sort of let you know what's going on in the book, because I think that's interesting and helpful. And then I'll share just some of my kind of concluding thoughts and experience with reading the book. So first off, Anthony Trollope is someone that I have heard about as I've been reading. I love British literature. I love classic literature. I love Dickens. I love Austen. I love P.G. Wodehouse, all these different British writers. And so I have for a long time kind of had on my mental to read list, I need to read something of his. And as I was finishing an audiobook on the library app, I saw that they had this novel, The Warden, from Anthony Trollope. So I thought, okay, I'm going to give it a try. For some reason in my head, I had him pegged as someone like a P.G. Wodehouse, someone who was a humorist primarily, and that he was writing at the beginning of the 20th century, more in the Edwardian period. Actually, as you could hear from the intro I told you, the book was published in 1855. It's very much a Victorian work. He's more of a contemporary of Dickens than he is of Wodehouse, and while he is a funny writer, and there's some funny things that came out even in this book, he's also just a novelist. And so it was not what I expected it to be, because I had some wrong expectations. I don't know where I got this from, but it was a very enjoyable experience. I really, really liked the novel. So what is Trollope doing in this novel? Well, this book is the first book, like I said, that became widely successful of his novels. It's also the first book in a series, the Barchester, I think it's just called the Barchester series, or the Barchester Chronicles, the Barchester Chronicles. And there's a number of books that are all kind of taking place in the same, with some of the same characters and in the same sort of setting of this fictional town of Barchester and the cathedral there and everything. My understanding, again, this is the only Trollope novel I've read, is that the other books in this series you could really read kind of in whatever order. They're not it's not a tight series in that sense. But The Warden is the first book in the series, and from what I understand, it's the best place to start, because if you jump later, you might get some spoilers from this first novel. But it starts off by just sort of describing this very quiet, peaceful place, this fictional cathedral town of Barchester, and it focuses on this charity that is attached to the cathedral. It's called the Hospital. It was established in the 1400s by this wealthy merchant named John Hiram, and when he died, he donated the building and the land and whatever proceeds came from the land to the hospital. And the idea was he wanted to have a place where poor men who had no families but were beyond their working years could come and have a comfortable living. So the idea is he wanted to provide kind of a refuge for 12 men who would otherwise probably just have starved to death, by giving them a kind of modest allowance and a safe place to stay. And they were to have a warden who was appointed to the hospital to help care for their spiritual needs in particular, and just sort of be their companion and things. That was kind of the setting for this hospital. Well, over the centuries, what happens is that the lands that John Hiram donated become very, very profitable, and the income that is going to the warden, which is appointed by the church, just kind of balloons and grows, whereas the amount that's being given to the 12 pensioners, the 12 old men who live at the hospital, stays fairly flat and is very modest. And so that's sort of the setting into which this story comes, and it focuses in on Mr. Harding, who is the warden of Barchester Hospital, the hospital there. When we meet this character, he is he's a widower. He has an adult daughter who's living with him. He's caring for the 12 old men. He loves music. He's presented in a very positive way. His older daughter has married someone named Archdeacon Grantley, who was actually the bishop's son. And the warden and the archdeacon are very different personalities. The warden is very kind of retiring and self-effacing and just wants a quiet life. The archdeacon is very much kind of the bulldog of the diocese, and he wants to go in and defend the honor of the church, and he's a very practical, kind of pragmatic man in certain ways. And so there's a strong kind of contrast there. But that's the sort of setting or characters that Trollope gives us. What's interesting is in the first chapter, if I remember right, he spends the whole first chapter without any spoken dialogue. He just sort of describes the setting, the situation that we're entering into. And you might be wondering at this point, what in the world is this novel about? Because nothing that you said sounds gripping or interesting. But he's dealing with very ordinary, everyday things, and the tension comes in next. So there's this young man named John Bold, Dr. Bold, who comes to Barchester with his sister. He becomes kind of independently wealthy, and he's a reformer, and he's always looking for injustices to right and problems to address. And so, as you can imagine, he and Dr. Grantley don't get on very well, the archdeacon. They have kind of very different personalities. But Mr. Bold finds a welcome at the Harding household. In fact, he is very much falling in love with Mr. Harding, the warden's daughter, Eleanor, and it looks like they're about to be engaged. However, the tension comes in when John Bold decides that the situation that has evolved at the hospital over these last centuries, where the church-appointed clergyman is getting, £800 a year, this big income with very little actual work to do to get it, while the 12 old men are getting a lot less, is this great injustice, and he decides to take up that cause. And so the whole novel centers around that. You have John Bold, who is fighting to have the warden's income reduced and the 12 men given a higher income, and you have Archdeacon Grantley, who is the warden's son-in-law, who's kind of taking up the cause against John Bold. So if you think about the situation, you've got Mr. Harding, the warden, and you have one son-in-law, the archdeacon, who's fighting to maintain the rights of the church, and you have a potential or future son-in-law who's kind of moving for reform, and Mr. Harding is caught right in the middle. And the warden, Mr. Harding, really is the central character in the story, as it becomes kind of clear as you unfold. What you end up having then, so I won't tell you how all that resolves, okay, but what you end up having in this novel then is a fascinating set of character studies, because all of these men, Mr. Bold, who's kind of the reformer, Archdeacon Grantley, who's kind of the face of the conservative cause, trying to defend his father-in-law's income, and Mr. Harding, who is this affable clergyman, all of them from different vantage points are open to critique, and all of them from different vantage points are commendable. And other characters kind of get added into this as well. The newspapers become part of the story. The bishop is part of the story. Mr. Harding's daughter, Eleanor, is part of the story. So you kind of look at all the different characters, and they're very complex because, in a sense, all of the people involved are very normal people. None of them are perfect. None of them are above criticism, but none of them are kind of evil or wicked. There's no sort of good guys and bad guys kind of crassly conceived. And so what ends up happening is that you have this novel, which is about something that to many people is probably not going to sound interesting, a kind of dispute over clergy income and the distribution of church property and finances. And Trollope takes that very ordinary, mundane material and turns it into a fascinating window to explore human character, human motivation, conscience, honor, and many other kind of universal themes. Along the way, Trollope is also a very good writer. So I told you when I first had heard about him, I had the idea that he was kind of a P.G. Wodehouse. In many ways, that's not true. He's not writing, P.G. Wodehouse is very kind of frothy and fun writing. and he enjoys the English language, but he's not writing serious novels, right? Trollope's novel, this one, The Warden, is a serious novel, and yet it's kind of written with a twinkle in his eye, and he shows that in a couple of ways. First off, again, he's just a very good writer. He has a good grasp of the English language, and he enjoys playing and working with the language. So in his descriptions, he'll sometimes, give you just these little runs of alliteration, that are kind of fun. Or he might kind of give you this wonderful kind of sarcastic or knowing take on something. There's a couple of times in the novel where he kind of breaks the fourth wall and he sort of speaks as the author in a way that feels very modern. So as I was reading Trollope, I thought, okay, I had the idea he was more modern, found out he was actually Victorian, but as I'm reading him, I thought this guy is ahead of his time because he feels very modern in some ways. Breaking the fourth wall, characters that are very morally complex and nuanced, is more of a hallmark of what I think of 20th century novels having compared to 19th century novels. In fact, there's a fascinating section of the book where Trollope is, in his narrative voice, kind of takes a dig at Charles Dickens. He doesn't name him as Charles Dickens, but what does he call him? Mr. Sentimental, I think. And he's basically talking about how in Dickens novels, he's using his sentimental novels to advance the cause of social justice and right wrongs and all those types of things. And so he paints with a very broad, clear brush, strong colors. You have really good characters and really bad characters. And you can tell Trollope is kind of critiquing that. He's kind of poking fun. Now, I love Charles Dickens. I love the novels. I love the BBC, dramas and things. So I'm not anti-Charles Dickens at all. However, I think it's undeniably true that Dickens does he writes for a popular audience. He writes in a very kind of transparent, clear way. There's not subtle nuances to unpack in terms of his characters as much as there are being other writers. I'm not saying that he's not a genius. I think he is from a literary perspective. But part of his genius is learning how to tell fascinating stories with universal appeal in a very popular and easily digestible way. So this is not a critique of Dickens, but that's what he's doing. Trollope is very much trying to explore how, okay, how do you, what motivates people? And how can you have a situation of tension and misunderstanding and kind of two sides where you still have both sides that are acting kind of in good faith? And in that sense, I said it's a very modern novel. There's a sense in which I think Trollope's view of human interaction, life, motivation is actually something we need more of in the modern world, because I think particularly in the last decade or two, we have kind of fallen back into this like very black and white. There's good guys, there's bad guys, there's my guys, there's your guys, very divided kind of way of looking at humans and looking at human motivation. Not a lot of sympathy, not a lot of nuance. I think Trollope's novels would actually challenge us to think about, okay, who's on the other side? Because this whole novel is sort of about a debate with definite sides, and yet how can they kind of come to understand what's motivating the other? And again, I won't tell you how Trollope resolves that, but the character of the Warden becomes the person who, it all kind of starts because of him, but his character and the way he responds to this crisis is what will also bring it to a resolution that's really, really fascinating. So without telling you any more about what Trollope does, those are just some things to look for as you perhaps read the novel yourself. But I really, really enjoyed this book. I'm excited to maybe get my hands on some of the later books and read some more from him. Very enjoyable writer, some funny bits, very well written bits, clever characters, memorable story, and again, using very everyday things, very ordinary things, very mundane things to probe into and explore some of the truly abiding human problems and characteristics, which is what all good literature should do. So I can see why this book is a classic. I can see why Trollope is a well-loved writer, and I look forward to reading more. If you've not read any, I would encourage you to perhaps consider starting with this book, The Warden by Anthony Trollope.